Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for the Jurica-Suchy Nature Museum's Darwin Day 2021 celebration. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Alfred Martin, who will be introducing the Alfred Martin Keynote Lecture speaker.
Hello. Our keynote lecture speaker today, our special guest speaker that we're honored to have is Dr. Drew Langham. Dr. Langham is an alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology at Clemson University in South Carolina. Dr. Langham has a Bachelor of Arts degree in zoology, a Master of Science degree in zoology, and a PhD in forest resources and wildlife biology, all from Clemson University. He currently holds an endowed chair as alumni distinguished professor, and he's ranked as a master teacher. He sees conservation as a combination of science and art. What a thrilling and unique way. Combination of science and art. And as such, he serves on a board of several conservation foundations. Dr. Langham is a widely published author, a poet, and a wildlife biologist. He does research involving the impact of human activities on conservation. How do humans affect conservation of wildlife? He also researches how forest management affects the animals in the forest, insects, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. And very interestingly, he's interested in how ethnicity relates to wildlife. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Drew Langham, our distinguished speaker.
My name is Drew Langham, and it is my pleasure to be with you here in South Carolina at Benedictine University in this wonderful celebration of the museum and of Darwin and all things evolving, I suppose. I'd like to take my time this evening to share with you in sort of a patchwork kind of way some thoughts on our current age, some ideas on how we can move forward in our thinking about where we are in the realm of geologic time, but also where we are in our current plight. And so you will hear me mention a great deal about birds because I'm an ornithologist by training. At Clemson University, they called me a bird man. I'm a cultural and conservation ornithologist, and that means that I try to blend feathers with our hope for making things better through conservation. And so I'll start by talking about this age of alarm that we're in, this Anthropocene that sort of asks us, I think, to wake up and to be woke, or maybe just somnambulate our way through. So it's the Anthropocene murk, where blind faith is the same old stupid warmed over. Our piety needles, I think, are all pegging out. Screaming in their extreme, they are straining to be perfect in proclamations of pseudo-righteousness. They are begging us to ignore the greater good and stake some solo moral claim to high ground that in fact sinks by the day in a rising sea of what's to come. Truth be told, I cannot even practice my fresh killed, organically grown carnivory in peace because of the self-righteous soy footprints that are blotting out the sun. Carbon be damned. We've taken the wild and locked it away, and now many of us have none. Black bears' lives matter more to many than mine. I had a question to ask you, if a ton of tofu sucks up the habitat of wild things, but there's no one there to jot that data down, can the green truth still be claimed? Is that deal new or even green? Right now, billionaire Nero's fiddle and the Amazon burns or comes to my front door in a cardboard box made of forests. And right now, we choke on our own snot. So please get the shot. But we still kill one another with numb regularity. We become comfortable with high def death. Too much of it under blue knees who neither served nor protected us. And then we wonder when the next supermarket aisle 3 mass murdering is scheduled for. Will there be more hopes, more prayers served? We are far left, and then we are far right, and hardly find the in between. Man makes God and the plans laugh. Me, I've progressed beyond my own liberalism mainly, and thinking I've regressed to some common sense. Meanwhile, many have conservatized themselves to not thinking at all. Let's cue the anonymous conspiracies. Too many explain away what can't be explained, as it's easy for them to believe that Sasquatches mate like rabbits in Barack Obama's backyard, and that those same Bigfoot voted absentee ballot because they are brown. Who's to blame for this current eel tangle that's writhing unsolvably, that even Gordian could not solve with a sharp cutting knife? I think us. We are to blame. And so it's my way of addressing in this manifesto poem, Benedictine you, our current situation of this conflict and this consternation, and how we are to proceed along this evolutionary path. I mean, after all, evolution has no ultimate form, but really is this journey that we take along this adaptive path. But this is a grounded age, and I've decided to, at least for now, define it as this age of woe, but also the age of woe, the grounded age, until further notice, the Anthropocene is officially grounded. And no, this warning has little to do with those marvels of science that we all know about, those marvels that engender our time aloft by engineered finagling of lift, of thrust, or even flotation. These engineered marvels that would include balloons or zeppelins, propellered or jet-fueled wing tubes that we all know as airplanes, the whirling bladed hoverers known as helicopters, the engineless elegant gliders, the unmanned spy and killing craft that we know as drones. Even those super caffeinated daredevils in shiny skin-tight squirrel suits tossing themselves between canyons, or the Richie Rich manned rocket ships that have elevated human ego to these new hyper-capitalistic heights. No, this grounding, Ben Yu, has nothing to do with our hominid obsessions for time in the clouds, and everything to do with what we've destroyed in the process of not paying attention to those beings who by simple whim can do what we must gain tower clearance for, that we must flip switches and push buttons for, that we must manipulate rudders and flaps or regulate helium flow and adjust angle of attack to do. No, this grounding of our own making is born of greed, a promulgation of malice, and this long, long history of abject, practiced ignorance aimed at tearing things apart. Now, mind you, none of this is mutually exclusive, and in fact, usually compounds interest on the other thing. So it all brings us to this grounded status that I'm particularly keen to, aware of as an ornithologist. It's a feather diminished age of woe is us that we can count. 3 billion birds, 3 billion with a B, gone in the last 50 years. And that's by conservative estimates. That's my grounding. Intending no disrespect to ostriches, rheas, emus, cassowaries, kiwis, Guam rails, cockapoos, penguins, and the rest of the flightless crew that evolution saw best to bind to the earth for now, this current predicament of grounding that we're in is Rachel Carson's worst nightmare, dropped dead as a pesticidally poisoned rain crow from the campus trees. Billions gone in about the same amount of time that it took to go from cloth-covered wings at Kitty Hawk to sound barriers breaking and nuclear bombs wiping out entire cities. In less time than I've been on this earth as a 50-something, quickly closing in on 60, I might add, we've managed to lay waste to billions. That includes one of the most abundant birds on earth, the passenger pigeon. Now, when unfathomable, uncountable, sky-darkening flocks of birds that it took days to pass, flocks breaking limbs, are killed with abandon without cause or pause. When they dwindle to one pathetic, dead-ended, matronly named individual in a mid-sized Midwestern city zoo cage, what does that say for us? What does it say for us when the next bird on this roll of forever gone, the Carolina parakeet, with this contrived indigenous name of Incas, dies in the same cursed aviary cage? Can Emily Dickinson's hope, defined by soul perched things with feathers, be taken to heart? And is there any coincidence that during the same time that so many birds were being sent to the smite shed without second thought, that the Gilded Age was turning out technological innovations and sociopathological interventions one after the other? So much of what defines us now, the camera, the telephone, the automobile, the airplane, but then the repeating rifle, mustard gas, trench warfare, aerial bombardment, X-rays, missiles, all of these developed at the same time that we as human beings were perfecting the art of doing away with ourselves by warfare, by native genocide, by constitutionally sanctioned enslavement, by power-brokered misogyny and ramped-up colonialism. What does the magnitude of that number, billions, mean exactly? I mean, when I see billions, as one might think, I consider grains of sand on a beach uncountable, or maybe blades of grass on a prairie. Billions to me is the stars or particles of dust that we come from, miles and years distant, that we can't measure, that are just now reaching us as light from lamps in heaven that no longer exist. Light that once even shone on the plumbiest backs and rosy breasts of those passenger pigeons that are now all gone, or on the cypress green backs of those Carolina parakeets that are now gone. Lights that once shone on heath hens, on big beaked dodos, on great auks, on clam-eating Labrador ducks, on ivory-billed woodpeckers, worthy of Lord God status. Light that shone on the backs of Bachman's warblers, on dusky seaside sparrows, on Eskimo curlews, on birds no one ever saw or even had the chance to name after some genocidal racist, faded into oblivion. Billions of birds within a few measly human generations. For all these birds, we made the way to goneness simple. How did we do that? We plowed under, we cut down, we paved over, we warmed up, we sprayed out and burned down everything that we could to grind so much avian traffic to a halt. Think of it. We can't even communicate now without our words swatting warblers and thrushes from the night sky with towers of babbling raised cloud high. As our pet kitties grab sparrows by the throats and present them to us as gifts on our back porch steps, we'll need to begin to think of names we'll hang on the last blackbird's aviary cage. I wonder if Donald or Karen would fit. How about George or Brianna? Maybe that's more like it. Dead without cause. They hold that in common. Will anyone protest their disappearance, I wonder? Will we defund our avarice? Who will miss the last of the once common things? And if we do mourn all the birds dying, dropping from the sky like a billion Icarus's pinions, melted to dripping, having flown too close to our metaphorical sun of progress, we'd better learn to appreciate the immigrant enslaved stickituity of European starlings who, despite being brought to the shores of a country they'd never asked to visit, seem to at least have the temerity to make it through the storms we keep conjuring. Now, I sit in my suburban backyard for the past, almost 2 years, quarantined and grounded from my usual Sasquatched, carbon-loaded, continent-trotting air travel to talk at others about saving the earth. I mean, that's sort of why we are kind of gathered here. You know, we're celebrating a museum, we're celebrating evolution, we're celebrating one of the people who brought this theory, this way of thinking into our brains. And we've been grounded by a virus that won't let up. And it comes to mind that the globe actually exhaled in this time of me and many others not hopping on one of those contrived dreams of flight that I just talked about. So when I multiply my grounding by tens of millions, not throwing jet fuel flumes into the atmosphere, there's this silver lining in the plague-thickened dark cloud. So I sit in the backyard, sort of a terrarium, I suppose, of my own making. I sit there and in the spring watch rose-breasted grosbeaks and scarlet tanagers, watch great crested flycatchers and chimney swifts bring the bigger world to my tiny southern South Carolina Piedmont backyard. That for me has been joyous relief from the constantly depressing news that streams by persistently. And in those moments, I trade neotropical migrants for migraines. But then in those moments of joy, there's this bitter feeling, and I can feel fewer birds than any time in my 56 years. The billions isn't conceptual or modeled or opined in labs somewhere with stats no one without 3 degrees could understand. This is a palpable loss in this age of woe. It's a tangible absence of plumage, of song and calls. So every bird I see, whether allegedly common northern cardinal or list-worthy olive-sided flycatcher at the top of the neighbor's dying maple snag, it's worship-worthy for me in a way that we sort of dirt-bound Homo sapiens have always looked up to find escape from our opposable-thumbed anchors and anxieties. I know the causes for all that ails us bird-wise. That's not difficult to figure out. The science is relatively simple. But in my abacentric skin, which is, by the way, blacker than many would like, too left-leaning perhaps for others, too southern, too rural, and maybe not black enough for some, I know what the silence on a May morning portends. I know what the quiet sky minus migrating thrushes that thirp, thirp, thirp on a full-mooned October night signals. I know what the shoreline with only a few red knots to untangle from the mixed flock of shorebirds means. Grounded, wings clipped, skies emptying. I can feel the heaviness of them draining and know what Icarus's daddy Daedalus must have known as he watched with dread his son's ego get the best of him. Icarus's fall was inevitable, the plunge quite predictable, but it was also avoidable if he had flown with a little more caution, had listened. Fly, but take care not to ruin your wings. Fly, but respect the limits of your being. Fly, but understand you aren't them. Icarus didn't listen. Seems like for all of our propellers, our thrusters, and navigational aids, we haven't heeded any warnings either. And so here we are, grounded in all of this loss, Benedictine. Do I have an answer? No, I don't have answers necessarily, but I do have maybe a response. And my response is that I think that in order to deal with this age of woe and this age of woe, that maybe for all of those years of me running from religion and organized church, and I'm still on the run from that, by the way, that maybe that my solution is the God that I've always worshiped, which is wildness. Wildness, yes, it's the God that I worship. And in that church, in that worship, I think the sins to answer for are intrusion and extinction. In that church, for my wild God, evolution is as miraculous a creation theory as any story of seas splitting. The primordial ooze maybe came to be named Adam. Lucy of the old divide blossomed to Eve. I don't think that Eve was a spare rib of a him, but of her own womb conceived. On the 7th day, billions of years from that first day, God still can't take a break. That rock that she slung out with a bang from the dark to rest 3 places from this modest star called the sun throbs and pulses under a cloud of human combusted funk. There have been many floods and several arcs. The raven that never came back didn't return, in fact, because it didn't want to get eaten like the witless dove with that olive branch. Maybe the raven was too smart, maybe too black to fall for the drunken old sailor's trick. My grandmother, Mamatha, sang that it wouldn't be water but fire next time. That's the promise that her God made. Turns out that he may have been half right. You know, I frequently wonder how all those dinosaurs fit into that little boat. Anyway, the next reckoning is coming, maybe already here, rising around our ankles now, but was glacial ice just a little while back. Our Earth, we know, is on a slow burn, trying to drown itself back to cool. Mountains rose and are still falling, ground down grain by grain, from granite to pebbles to sand to silt. We are all the alluvium sliding back to sea, ashes to the Atlantic, ground like grain under pumice to the Pacific. We are dust in the wind. Cain, in fact, continues to slay Abel daily by chokehold, by gerrymander. Polar bears are the one white thing I can think of that are suffering injustices these days. You know, for my wild God, it turns out that she liked it best when everything was connected in a single congealed Pangeic mass. It might have been easier for her to walk from pole to pole without getting her feet wet in a single great sea. And meanwhile, the angels ask the question, is forever why things have gone the way of the dodo, and why are some of us still here? If restoration ecology means making things like they were, I would like those times again. So conservation, I think, demands a church. No, I'm not speaking of any high steeple, stained glass temple. No walled places to worship some deity we can neither see nor feel, that is cast in the likeness of a Eurocentric oppressor, but rather a church where some unified knowing that what we have to communion over is the work we do. And in this like-mindedness, this kindred spiritedness, to imbue some hope that what we enact to save will make tomorrow better than today. So given this current state of our environment and these convergent plagues, I think that our church out there is essential. With hellish fires burning the world up from the ice caps down, another flood, perhaps drowning polar bears and little asthmatic black girls in the lower 9th ward in the same hot breath, with no arcs for us to board, with brimstone falling in the form of policies torn apart as viruses leap from wild beasts to human beasts, and we in the meantime continue to kill one another with random acts of violence. It seems our time to regather the congregation of wildlings for some sort of meditative dawn chorus, a song singing that clarifies the fog in which we are wandering. There has to be some coming together in concerted worship of the us, those of us concerned with being here in some semblance of peace with ourselves and with other beings. So no high steepled, stained glass, walled places, but wildness under the canopies of trees with autumn falling leaves. on seashores with our toes and billions of grains of sand that we would welcome to count rather than declines of birds that we have to count in the same way. No trusses or beams, no brick, no mortar, but mud, prairie grass. We'll find scripture to adhere to, but it'll be the science, rigorous investigation and data that are objectively gathered, chapter and verse, the what, the how, the when, the where, the why. But then there will be other data that's just as critical. It'll be the data first gathered, that data that's gathered in first person, the I, that data that stopped you at the mud puddle that suddenly had hundreds of commas in the form of tadpoles that said stop, look, revere. That data that we gather in the first song of the morning birds that awakens us will take that data gathered and transform self in purest wild places that we can find. It need not be far away in some remote corner of the earth, but perhaps some pocket park nearby. I would encourage you to record, to write the data even, and publish if you will, but don't perish on the printed page. Speak your truth through verse and prose. Yes, pass it by peers for choir review, but then beyond the tomes, we must go outside of our shelves and put the data out in heart-rending ways. Let the words fly from head beyond the echo chambers to inform and inspire others. There's nothing to stop professors from becoming poets. Don't let the lines flatten in the expectation of literary acclaim. Claim your own literary niche. Yes, our scripture will be the science, rigorous investigation, but it'll also be the poetry. It'll be the lyric. And Marvin Gaye will sing the Ecology, and it will be timeless and good, but the lyrics less relevant because we are doing better. Humpback whales will breach and belch song in a baritone chorus. Wolves will lift their jowls to the waxing full moon and howl. Thrushes will harmonize with themselves. And the rest of the birds, the beasts, including those of us called Homo sapiens sapiens, those of us left over will smile, kneel in our hearts, and say, Amen. So thank you, Benedictine University. Thank you to all who have taken part in collaborating for this celebration, for this time together. I hope that my message has brought to you this whole idea of this sort of ever-evolving treatment of how we think about nature in our heads, but how we feel about nature in our hearts, and that ultimately the outlet for the adaptation that occurs between head and heart is through our voices. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and I look forward to the day that comes when we can be together and commune in some wild space together. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much to everyone joining our program tonight. We are very excited to have Dr. Lanham here with us. Please either type your questions into the chat or use the raise hand function so that we know that you would like to speak, and we welcome questions from the group at this time. We do have a question in the chat. What can we do as individuals on a daily basis to pay more attention and support these birds?
Thank you for having me sort of across the continuum of space and time, Benedictine. I think that in that question is really the answer. It's to notice, right? It's to slow down. It is to pay attention to the ephemeral nature of life, the ephemeral nature of life, of everything, human being, bird, and understand that it's fleeting, and understand that the common thing that you see can become the rare, then extinct thing, that the person that you speak to one day can be gone the next. So I think in noticing is our response. And excuse me, that means that we have to slow down, right? That means that we have to take a beat and really begin to think about how we measure life. How we measure life. And that's a big issue that we are dealing with even in the current moment. And so for the birds, understanding that those birds are allegory. Those birds are allegory for our lives, for our freedom, for our persistence. And even as birds are persecuted, even as wildness is persecuted, it finds ways to persist. And so by noticing those things that you see, that you may take for granted as common, there's this opportunity to revel in their presence, right? To revel in their presence. And in reveling in their presence, you hopefully will work to mitigate or avoid their absence. So notice, slow down, palms up. And it's a funny thing, the birds notice when you're there in sort of this accepting way. So that's the individual way to go, I think. On a larger scale, of course, supporting those organizations that support birds, paying attention again to those who would have you believe that they are protecting life, but really are working against it in other ways. So that's an important thing to notice, to keep a sharp eye out and not just have your binoculars up, but take those binoculars down and increase your field of view, right? And we all have, this vestigial eye of sorts, this pineal gland, but I like to think of the third eye as the one that rests close to the center of your chest. That's the eye that we see with, that we feel with. And so for the birds, feeling the birds, as much as watching the birds, is one of the ways for us to protect the birds, because that's empathy, right? When we begin to feel for others, when we begin to feel for life in a way that allows us to value life in a way that we just don't wander and randomly take it, we can move in a different direction. But until we slow down and notice and have that heart that feels and sees the way for us, I feel we're in danger, and the birds and other beings will be too.
Thank you for that. Dr. Novak Gotcha, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to jump in?
Thank you, Dr. Lanham, for your wonderful blending of poetry to advocate for wildness. I have my cat here too, a little bit of wildness. You mentioned the dawn chorus, and birdsong is really one of those great mysteries of language that really I don't think any of us truly understand. And for many people, poetry, even in English or a language we speak, is also sometimes difficult. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit when your inspiration for birds and kind of the expression of wildness in nature and through poetry kind of arose.
Thank you for that question, Phil. And what's your kitty's name?
This is Tinkerbell.
Hey, Tinkerbell.
Tiny.
Our tabby, gray tabby, is named Trey. You know, I think it's that started for me when I was very young, and noticing birdsong when I would walk from my grandmother's house to my parents' house, and it's roughly a quarter of a mile. But in that quarter of a mile, on a spring morning, one of the first things that I would hear, of course, were cardinals and Carolina chickadees. But the sound that I probably one of the songs that I first recognized was that of the wild turkey, of eastern wild turkey. And to hear those birds gobbling in the bottom that was pretty far away from my grandmother's house when I was a kid, it seemed like it was much further than it actually is now, of course. But then to hear that chorus awaken, to hear a barred owl, to hear quail calling, to hear those quail calling covey back together after I had walked past and perhaps flushed them from some thicket, to hear my grandmother's rain crows, yellow-billed cuckoos, all of that began to sort of converge in on me at a very early age. And I was able in my head to identify the who was making what sound. And you'll hear me frequently, Phil, refer to birds not as whats, but as whos. Because I think part of our problem in protecting wildness and life is that we've objectified so much. And so those birds, those songs became ways for me to know my neighbors. Those birds were essentially, I'd like to think of them as, you know, as sort of these beings that lived in these different houses, different habitats along the way in that quarter mile. So I remember the first tapes that I ever bought, bird tapes, and it was long after, you know, those early years. I was in college, but I bought the Borer songs, the Borer Guides to Bird Songs. These were cassette tapes, and I just could not get enough of birdsong. I do remember listening to albums in the library of bird songs, and they just stuck in my head. They just stuck. And I'm really terrible with human names frequently. But I remember bird names. I remember bird songs pretty well, even now, as I'm looking not too far from the 6th decade of my life. But that dawn chorus now still is something that I can't sleep through. I almost anticipate it, but in my head, the marker is, you know, the first Carolina wren or cardinal that sings, I'm up. I can't sleep through that bird song. And likewise, the other night, as I was leaving a little place that I have, the barred owls were cranking up, right? And just that, woo, woo, and just calling back and forth to one another was sort of vespers for me. So as the birds communicate good morning and good night, it sort of bookended my life in that way. And now with winter, and it's also a seasonal sort of meter, white-throated sparrows that are down here now, they're singing every day. And that plaintive song tells me that winter is here or soon will be, and that these birds have come from some faraway place. I don't know where, but they bring the world to me. And so every song registers a who, and it helps me register a place, because I know where most of these birds are coming from or possibly coming from. So even hearing the call of a plover overhead, that's the sound of the Arctic. That may soon be the sound of Patagonia, as that bird makes its journey from the top of the earth to the bottom of it, one pole to the other. So that's how song sort of it impacts me. And I almost use the word infect, but I'm going to use that word. That's a word that we know well these days, but we can be infected with good and good things, and I think we should seek those. And I look at Tinkerbell as you hold your family, right? That just tells me that you have not objectified that individual. And so I think for me, for birds, it's been that way for a while, and it's only become more intense.
Thank you. I think if we all looked at trees as our neighbors and relatives and friends, we'd be better off. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
We have another question from the chat. Is there a specific type of bird or species that you study?
Well, primarily, my original research, the first bird research that I did was actually with eastern bluebirds, a bird that many are familiar with, Cyalia cyalis, and a bird that's familiar to many. But I did that work as an undergraduate researcher with Dr. Patty Gawadi, who is a very famous ecofeminist. And so that bird, we were studying mating systems. It was called uncertain paternity. So that study helped establish the role of female choice in mating systems of passerines. Passerines are songbirds. And so I went from studying eastern bluebirds with Dr. Gawadi to studying forest passerines in my doctoral research, mainly warblers, so prairie warblers and yellow-breasted chats especially, but also other birds like eastern towhees and indigo bunting, sort of these birds that are associated not with mature forest, but with regenerating forest, and trying to understand how birds of that early cirral stage were impacted by things like forestry and natural disturbances that come in and take out trees. These days, I like to tell people that my favorite birds are the ones with feathers, but I'm sort of stuck, pun intended, on loggerhead shrikes, because that is a bird that has this sort of biphasic nature. It's a passerine, but that has a raptorial nature, and by that I mean that it's a songbird that preys on large insects, but also on small rodents, sometimes small birds, reptiles, and amphibians. And because it has weak feet, it doesn't have the strong gripping feet of a raptor. It impales its prey on thorns, on barbed wire, and such. But it was a bird that has been perceived as evil for a good portion of the 19th and 20th century, and has declined rapidly across most of its range. And so it's a bird that sort of has these two lives, and those two biphasic lives or lifestyles that it has have resulted in it having identity issues. So I study birds in ways that bring them into, hopefully, people thinking about them beyond just sort of these robots, these biological, these sort of hardwired, instinct-driven automatons that don't think, that don't feel, because we can't know what birds feel. quite honestly. We know some of what they think through birds like parrots and crows, but we're learning things every day. Crows, the research that just came out that's talking about crow self-awareness, right? So crows not only can identify us by our individual faces, but crows are aware of who they are, of their standing in a crow world. And so I think for me, that's why I say my favorite bird is the one with feathers, because we're constantly discovering new things. But every time we discover something new, for me, it just points out how much there is that we can never really know.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat about how birds use their songs. And is it in general communication? Do they use it for mating or defending their territory? And do males sing more often than females?
Oh, great questions. Well, yeah, it's communication, right? And in the old days, we thought of it just as well, actually, before sort of science kind of stepped in and people were doing research, birds thought, or humans, many humans thought that birds sang for the pleasure of human beings. And so this resulted in people keeping birds in cages, for example, nightingales or painted buntings or whatever song pleased them. We know now through a lot of research, or at least we think we know, birds, yeah, they're using this songs and calls. They're songs which tend to frequently be more complex than calls. So the song of the call of a bobwhite quail, that may be a male's way of advertising territory, but then other birds, that male and other birds may do covey calls, that calls a dispersed group of birds back together. Quail are very social birds. So we can think about song as advertisement. We can think about song as declaration. You know, anything that we can imagine we do with communication, birds are doing, but often in an extraordinarily complex way. Birds can sing several notes at once. A wood thrush is actually sort of harmonizing, it's duetting with itself, if you can imagine that. Birds are also hearing, right? Likely an order of magnitude better than we can. So what sounds loud to us is absolutely sort of bombastic to a bird. So, you know, song is also highly regional. There are sort of these clades to bird song. So, I mean, think of it almost as accents. You can look at a widespread bird like a song sparrow, and that song sparrow song, it holds sort of the same pattern, but then is very different from birds, for example, in the Southeast than it is for birds in the Pacific Northwest, or birds in the Midwest in Illinois, or any place else. So you begin to think about, again, the variability, the variation within birds, and that leads you to this wonderment that I have for them, that they are so incredibly diverse, so incredibly complex, that we could never pigeonhole birds into a single character. And that makes them absolutely wonderful. You may be able to see on the wall behind me sort of this curly Q that's coming out, and there's a bird that is a prairie warbler, and that was painted for me by a woman I met up in Homer, Alaska, Erin Ray, and that bird, she was painting bird songs. So as an artist, let's think about again how birds influence us. When she listened to prairie warbler song, which is really sort of this, to me, it sounds like it's this climb up the chromatic scale, this Z, Z, And that bird is often sitting on a sapling on a spring morning. It maybe has just crossed the Gulf a couple of days ago, and it's singing its little heart out, advertising, I'm here, I'm on territory, you come here, you stay away. But that whole idea of birds singing just to hear themselves sing is a real possibility that we may never define. But again, that is the wonder, I think, that we have to grab onto at times, this ability to say, some of what I don't know is what inspires me to try to know more. So yeah, I could go on for a very long time about birdsong, but one of the things that I would encourage you to do is get on the net, look up, there's actually a website called Xenocanto, Xenocanto, and it has bird songs of the world. And let me tell you, it's a pretty deep dive, because you're going to hear some pretty freaky bird songs, some pretty scary ones at times, like a potu. It's that a potu is it's kind of like a giant whippoorwill. Thank you for that, Carly. That has it has this. That's communication. It sounds, kind of like maybe you're trying to throw your guts up or something, but that bird, that bird and that call of the potu, and there's another potu. You've got the greater and the common. The other potu has this call of, and you hear those in the dark forest. I've heard both of them in the Peruvian Amazon, and it sends chills down your spine when you hear indigenous people tell the story of what those bird songs mean to them, those calls. That is the call of children lost in the forest at night. And it's chilling, right? And it begins to then inform human culture, because many of us think that, those indigenous people are always out in the woods, in the forests, in the dark, in the middle of the night, doing things. No. And this is a story that they use to keep their children safe, and to say, look, the forest is a wonderful place. It provides for us, but it can also be a dangerous place. And so hearing that story that night of the potus was really a very powerful one for me. And so bird song not only informs birds of other birds, it can also inform us of other people's cultures and how they think about the world.
Sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute there for a second. So we have a couple of questions in the chat about impacts of climate change on birds, especially is it affecting their behaviors? One example was the bowerbird of New Guinea, and changes in migration or effects of bird songs.
Well, it's doing several things. I mean, it's changing patterns of, let's think about it as changing patterns of occupancy, right? So where you can be, right? That's a pattern of occupancy. When you can be there, right? So seasonality, and why you're there. So, where you can be. Let's use the example of the American robin, a bird that Roger Tory Peterson said that everybody should know. What's happening with American robins now is, for example, in the spring, those birds are showing up earlier back in the upper Midwest than they have. And they're showing up earlier in part. Now, understand that bird migration is driven by lots of factors. Day length, photoperiod is one of them. It can be weather. So things like ducks are facultative migrants. As long as there's open water, ducks aren't going anywhere. Or aren't forced to go anywhere. When the water freezes, they push further south. And so we can see sort of these patterns of occupancy where you are changing for robins. Robins are now appearing in places in the subarctic that people now don't have names for them. Some of the native peoples, the stories are that they don't have names for some of these new birds that are showing up and expanding their range. We can look again at when you show up. So again, talking about early robin migration, talking about duck migration. For my waterfowler, my duck hunter friends and people that I know in the Midwest, for example, in Stuttgart, Arkansas, a place that depends heavily on waterfowlers and duck hunting for its economy, has suffered in the past years because ducks are doing what we call short stopping. They're coming down from their Arctic breeding and summer grounds and not having to go as far south as fast because they're finding open water or water staying open much longer in Calgary, Alberta, or in South Dakota. So those ducks aren't coming down in January or February. They may come down, for brief periods, but then go back as water opens up. So that's sort of the where and the when, but then again, the why, right? As conditions change with climate change, as insect resources, for example, are available all year round, that birds adapt quickly. And that populations one of the things that we're seeing is sort of this rapid fire, as I call it, evolution. Evolution isn't something that takes millions of years. Certainly in the Grants and their work with Galapagos finches, and seeing just over a few generations birds' physical characteristics changing depending upon resource change. So again, a lot of this is happening so fast that it's difficult for us to keep up with. We talk about climate change and its impacts. We're seeing there are studies that talk about bird song now in some places going further in the diel cycle, birds basically singing all night and all day because of artificial lighting. All right, and you may have had that experience on campus or somewhere else where there's a robin singing in the middle of the night, and frequently that bird is in this place that's just all lit up. And so that artificial photo period begins to really sort of impact that bird's brain and its hormonal clock. So lots of this is happening, and it's climate change that's driving a lot of what's going on. But then think about all of the compounding factors that come along with climate change: habitat destruction, our cats being outside, or all of these things, glass windows that birds fly into. On our own campus here at Clemson, for example, I have a group of students who's going around and beginning to record birds that are killed and trying to come up with policies to help, hopefully, the university be more bird friendly. So all of those things, one bad thing compounds the other. We all want compounded interest on our savings. I think we have to compound our interest in how we're going to save the earth or save ourselves. The earth is going to be okay. It just depends on how long we're around to see what form it ends up in.
Thank you. Professor Morales, would you like to jump in? I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. And I see you raise your hand yourself, so go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tiara. One of the things that I forgot the last part of this question. Someone asked if male birds sing more than female birds. And I had to bring this thrilling research. This is critical. This thrilling research, and I need to write the name of the authors right up here. But one of the things that was sort of formerly the old thought, but a group of women researchers have determined that much of that bias of male researchers resulted in them underestimating the rate of singing among female birds. So who watches birds and who does the science? It matters, right? It matters. So anyway, I just wanted to get that in. I'm sorry, Professor Morales.
It's okay, no problem. I have a question about the taxonomy, and it kind of goes with what you just said. Have the bird associations been proactive in decolonizing some of the names of the birds and perhaps starting to edit some of the history behind them? For example, whenever I have birding friends, they ask about specific birds that they would like to see, and they will tell me names, and I'll be like, I have no idea what bird you're talking about. And they'll show me a picture of the bird, and I'll be like, oh, I know that bird, but I have a different name for it. And I just wonder if there's, with all the recent events, are we moving towards that?
Great question. There's some that are, I think about it a lot. It's funny. I was on the radio the other morning on NPR talking about that. Are they decolonizing? Not really. Let's be honest. There's that's moving really slow. People are, they're thinking about it. Part of what they're thinking about is how much money they might lose because they're going to lose donors. And so they can't they have to decolonize their mindsets first. And there's a colonization there that's extraordinarily damaging. So the organizations, you do have some that are thinking, that are starting to think about it, but in being proactive, so to speak. I don't think really in being as proactive as they could be, because everybody has to have their committees, and people sit around and pontificate probably for years, and then some jury delivers a verdict. So one of the things, may I call you Tiara? Am I pronouncing your name? So Tiara, I think, part of what I do as you do, is that, for example, Bachman sparrow, I no longer call it Bachman sparrow. I call it pinewood sparrow, which was actually the original name for it. I have a whole poem where I talk about all of these name changes that I have given birds, right? Because, I don't call LeConte sparrow. I call it orange-faced sparrow. And people are like, well, but that's not correct. Well, I mean, you gave it somebody's name. I'm giving it, a descriptive name that doesn't have some human attached to it. And so, that ego to get away from having to have somebody's name attached to some other being to define it, is important. And I mean, whose names have been attached to birds primarily? White men. So, how do we, I've suggested, for example, that Lewis's woodpecker not be, look, if you want to have anybody's name, call it Sacagawea's woodpecker. Here you had a Black man in the core discovery who saved the bacon of that core so many times. Instead of calling it Clark's nutcracker, call it York's crow. At least a Black man has a corvid, a smart, resourceful bird that you associate with a Black person. And so, but let's begin to disconnect having to have human names with birds. And so that whole initiative, there's a whole initiative, Bird Names for Birds, that's out there. You can look up that website, and talks a great deal about it. But it's causing a lot of controversy in the birding community because it's a community that's really pretty slow to change, right? Pretty slow to change. So right now, proactive is not a word that I would use with conservation. It's reacting. Conservation is reacting to what it should have been thinking about all along.
If I could ask one more question following that one.
Of course.
You just keep hitting all the right sentences for me. What has been helpful to you in your journey for advocating not only for the conservation of the birds, but who gets to be a part of the conservation of those birds?
What's been most useful for me?
Yes.
Honest questions. And people, you know, and I say that because oftentimes the questions, what people want to see frequently is they just want to see beautiful birds. You know, I used to go around the country and I would talk about the places I'd been and the birds I'd seen and how to identify those birds and maybe what the conservation causes are for those birds. And I still do that, but I always overlap those birds onto the maps of human beings so that people understand that we are sharing the air, the soil, the water, the earth with other beings. And so that's sort of been most helpful to me in a way to move empathy out there. And people would say, well, you can't be empathetic with a bird because you can't be a bird. I'm not asking you to be a bird, but I'm asking you to think about other living beings. And so it's been helpful to me when I say honest questions for people to ask what's on their hearts, right? And to move beyond the convention of what they've always known to maybe the discomfort of what they don't know. And so I remember when I started talking about birding while black and people didn't think that could be a thing, right? And then, you know, someone dies because they're black in a certain place, or someone dies because they're black doing a certain thing. So for that, when people ask those questions from their heart, that lets me know I can have a Zoom screen or a room of 100 people, right? If I get heartfelt questions, then I begin to feel a shift. And that's a shift in attitude about seeing life, but about seeing us, about seeing others who you may not have seen out watching birds. So those questions, like your questions, are critical. And as those questions come across, you know, these days, what helps me, God, goodness gracious, it's so hard to find hope. You know, Emily Dickinson said that hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. And you know, I write about that. Birds never fail me in giving me hope. And when humans fly free of their convention and ask heartfelt questions, it lends me to some degree of hope for us in thinking, okay, maybe we can get a little better and do a little better. So I hope that gets at your question.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We have another question in the chat. How would you suggest that we would strengthen our social ecological relationship? And do you have recommendations on how our students could help spread awareness about these issues and about birds?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that the pieces of music we've been talking about, bird song, that I frequently play is I play an old school piece. It's getting old. It's getting more old school by the day as I get older. But it's by Marvin Gaye. It's called the Ecology. And that song that was written in 70 or 71, I think 70, it's 51 years old, 50 years old. That song, subtitled Mercy, Mercy Me, the lyrics of that song that are really an anthem to what was going on in the 60s and the 70s with air pollution, with radiation, with extinction, with water pollution, all of those things that were going on that really haven't changed in all that time. And so, you know, I can think about growing up with that song, and then I think about our children who are now in their late 20s, early 30s, you know, groove into that song. And then my daughter, who teaches middle school, playing it for her middle school children. That's 3 generations, right? 3 generations listening to a song that the lyrics are still as applicable today as they were when it was written. And so I bring that up to say we can use music and art as a measure of how we're doing. So don't shy away just because a student might not have interest in naming every bird or identifying every bird or beetle or butterfly, that we can use the value of nature through art, through music. So I'm not just an advocate of STEM, which I am. I'm an advocate of STREAM, which is science, technology, recreation, engineering, arts, and math. And so to take the full breadth of who birds are, gosh, I can teach everything through a bird. I really can. And you know, it's without ever touching it, we can talk about everything from chemistry and physiology and history and engineering and music and you know, and the aesthetic of the visual arts. We can talk about all of these things through a single bird. So challenge your students to do that, right? One of the things that I do in my class is that I think about birds in haiku. So 17 syllables to describe some bird. And after those 17 syllables, to have somebody know that bird. You know, and that's a fun exercise. So that's one of the ways to do it. But then ultimately to think about our shared fate with birds. We've all heard of canaries in the coal mine, that old miners, they used to take canaries down into the earth with them. And those birds would sing as long as the air was sufficient. When the air became polluted with methane gas and other things, or carbon monoxide, those birds would stop singing and ultimately fall dead to the cage floor. And the miners knew that they had to get out if that bird wasn't singing. What are our canaries in the coal mine? And don't just think about the canaries in the coal mine as birds. Think about the canaries in the coal mines as how we treat one another. And when we think about that, then our world begins to merge in ways that's better. And I think then when we see that sort of convergence, that's a verdict that I can live with.
I also wanted to highlight a comment that we had in the chat from Dr. Kauth, who is, she has spearheaded a lot of our stewardship and sustainability on campus. She said, I love the idea of bringing heart to conservation and environmental problems. Often we are reserved about bringing heart into science publicly. I thought that was very, very true. You know, it's hard to combine those sometimes.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily true. And what we've done is we've objectified our true love for, why did we get into this? And I always say we got into it. I like to look at tadpoles. I love to look at tadpoles as a kid. And I had the realization the other day that those tadpoles, each of those little tadpoles was a tiny comma that caused me to pause. And so think back, go back, have child's mind, right? Go back and think about what got you into this in the first place. And it wasn't to become rich, it was to become enriched. And that's what nature does for all of us. We should not be looking to profit from it, except through the love and care of it that enjoins us in some greater sense than we can ever imagine. So thank you so much for that comment.
Thank you. Yes. So that was the last question we had. If anyone else has anything, feel free to reach out right now. But otherwise, this was a wonderful Q&A session with you. Thank you so much for joining us. And there are lots of comments thanking you in the chat already. And we really appreciate our time with you tonight and hearing all of your very interesting perspectives. Thank you. You have given us all a lot to think about.
Well, Carly, thank you, Benedictine, and please find me on @WildandInColor on Instagram, and thank you so much for the time. It's a difficult night, honestly, but this gives me a chance to talk about things that I love, and if we can spread love somehow in this world, wildness is one way that I do it. Words is another way that I do it. If we're able to somehow find one another in some sort of way, we can each render our own individual verdicts to some better day. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yes, and please do follow him on Instagram. And we very much appreciate everyone's time in joining us for this program tonight.
Be safe all. Take care.